Ladies and gentlemen, this is a big one that we have here to kick off tonight's show here on Sportinarium and for the weekend here on Sportinarium, because our guest was history making. He was enthralling. He was honorable. He was arguably the most important wrestler to Knockout Wrestling, otherwise known as KOW, company that we've gotten to cover here over the past several months. His feud with the Cumbrian outlaw, Rick Marcus, was arguably the greatest feud in the company's history. And his last match with the Cumbrian outlaw, Rick Marcus, and his last match to date was the number 2 match for KOW in 2019. He was a world champion in KOW. He was the first tag team champion in KOW. He was also an Alpha Omega Wrestling tag team champion. There's a long list of things I could say about our guest, but the most important thing I can say about him is it's going to be an honor to have him on the Sports Report, the #1 global sports show. And without further ado here on the Sports Report, the #1 global sports show, the greatest wrestler in KOW history, Chef Steele! My friend, how are you?
Wow, Tom, thank you. What an intro. I should have you follow me around and just introduce me to everybody like that. The honor is all mine to be on. Thank you very much.
Mr. Steele, I think if I followed you around everywhere you went, because you were a very famous man, a very popular man, I probably need a glass of water literally every step I walked. I certainly will know how Ethan Edwards and AOP felt when they introduced you to the ring, but it's a tremendous honor, champ, to have you. And obviously, this is something we had talked about with you off the air for quite a while, because your name has come up so many times in countless interviews with some of your peers and some of your colleagues, and even those you've been in the ring with, especially with the likes of the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus. And the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus has been one of the most important people, I think, to the history of Sportinarium and also to the history of the Sports Report. So a huge shout out to the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus, even though you and him had, again, the greatest rivalry, I think, in KOW history. And for our worldwide audience here, Sheriff Steele, I know that we had talked about this here with ALP when he came on the show last month. We're going to bring him back on. We're going to announce that here and talk about some of the things what we're going to talk about with you here. But for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, and we finally get to hear your side of the story of it. Talk about what it meant to you to be the number 2 match of the year with the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus in the retirement match, the Sheriff Rules match. It was the number 2 match of the year for KOW in 2019.
Well, that match was the culmination of, it must have been 3, maybe even 4 years of storyline that intertwined in and out of storylines that we had away from each other, but we kept coming back to each other, kept butting heads. Kind of, he was at one end of the spectrum, I was at the other end. And to have it all come to a head the way it did, and for it to be voted number 2 out of all the matches in 2019 was just an incredible honor. I was really proud to have that match, even in the top 10, but to be so high was just brilliant.
Absolutely, and congratulations to you again. And unfortunately, we'll talk about the outcome here in a few minutes. But there were so many spots in that match that I really think, in a lot of ways, really was the example of what KOW had to offer. And there was so many different things in the match. I mean, what are some of your favorite memories of that match?
Just the crowd reaction. I recently watched it back, and it's the first time I watched it back in probably since it happened. And the noise of the crowd, they were so loud and they were so into it. And that's always been what I've wanted to do when I step foot in the ring, is just to entertain the crowd and to get as loud a reaction as possible. And just to hear so high for the entire match means that me and Ricky did what we set out to do, and that was to put on a show that was going to excite the crowd.
You had a special relationship with the crowd for KOW. You had a special relationship with the people of Barrow. What made your relationship with the crowd so special?
I think it's because I started out, for KOW's first ever show, I was in the crowd. So, I came from the crowd and worked my way up from the bottom. And the good thing about the KOW crowd is there's a core group that come to every show. So for the 7 years it took me to go from the bottom to the very top, it was the same group of fans who were there throughout my entire journey. So they saw me start at the bottom, they saw me win the title at the end. Obviously they were there for the very end against Rick. So just to have them with me for the whole journey, it's almost like they were part of the whole journey. Without them, there was no Sheriff Steele.
Why was Rick Marcus such a special opponent for you?
Me and Rick both came through the academy, and we both kind of got into wrestling later in life. And I think we had parallels in so many ways, but he had a certain attitude towards getting what he wanted, which didn't quite match with my attitude of getting what I wanted. And I think that was just a perfect storm of two opposites come together, even though they were quite similar as well.
It's something interesting, and I want to go back to that because you talked about the fact that you got into wrestling a little bit later in life. And that's a bit of a comparison versus, let's say, last person that we spoke with for KOW, and that's the current showcase champion, Lucas Neon, or even somebody that you sort of know pretty well, I'm sure, in the Rat King 2-bit, and also the unhinged Will Carter, where they pretty much started out their careers as infants, as babies. I mean, you, let's say, in the Cumbrian Outlaw, Rick Marcus didn't start out in the business. Do you think that the relationship maybe with the crowd in KOW or the people of Barrow, maybe they saw something in that where they identified with you because of the fact that you actually got into the business a little bit later in life? Do you think that maybe starting out your career in wrestling later on in life, maybe the crowd and the people of Barrow actually saw something a little bit in you?
I think that could be right. I mean, Barrow is primarily a working class town. I think because I came into it so late and I didn't learn my craft from a young age, and I kind of came in probably later than I should have. I was 33 when I actually started wrestling. They probably saw me as kind of like an everyman. So, they could relate to me in a kind of, he's one of us, the underdog. I've always kind of billed myself as the underdog. And I think that's kind of what the crowd kind of takes you, and they want you to do well when you've got so much stacked against you. I mean, I'm in the ring, I was against guys who were sometimes they were 20 years younger than me, and I'm trying to keep up with these guys. And I think the crowd just wanted to get behind me because I had such a fighting spirit, like being the underdog.
Definitely showed in the ring that the crowd was definitely behind you. And specifically in that match against Rick Marcus, I felt like even those matches against Rick were different than some of the other matches that you had in KOW, for the simple fact that you guys actually brawled so much on the outside of the ring. There were so many spots in that match and some of the other matches you and him had throughout the time in KOW. Did you feel also in terms of how those matches went off, just because of sort of the outside you guys would use, whether it's the crowd, whether it's the spots outside the ring, or anything else that you might have used in those matches versus some other matches? Did you feel also that those matches maybe came across differently than other ones that you had in KOW?
Definitely. I think any of my matches or any of my interactions with Rick were always a little bit unpredictable. I wasn't often that I took my matches to the outside of the ring, but with Rick, it's just where we seemed to go, because the hatred built up between the two of us. The crowd didn't know what to expect. I mean, there was a moment in my retirement match where Rick actually had me dangling over the balcony. You could hear the crowd were really in shock about that one. So when you take it out into the crowd, when it's something that you don't normally do, the risk of, not the risk, but the excitement of something that you haven't seen before could happen. I think it really builds the crowd up, and they really seem to get behind it.
Have a match like that, knowing that going in, this could be the last match you're going to have, and it wound up being the last match. Did you feel any pressure? Did you maybe think about what could happen and maybe letting the crowd down or letting the people down, or even with Rick? Because again, you and Rick had some great matches. Rick is a great wrestler, and Rick has been able to do some really big things with you in your time in KOW. Was this a match that you thought about quite a bit?
Absolutely. I mean, it's always billed as the match where KOW was just, in the end, just wasn't big enough for the both of us. I certainly didn't want to retire and leave. So obviously the pressure was on there, because I had no intention of stepping away from KOW. And that's why I think I took things to another level in that match with Rick. I mean, I'm not normally one for climbing ladders and going through tables and things like that, but because the need for me to stay in KOW, because I have such a love for KOW and the fans, really kind of of ramped up the pressure. I mean, I went in, I was like a coiled spring before that match. And I think that definitely kind of took me to a different level, just because, like I said, that I really didn't want to have to retire.
And I know that the crowd didn't want you to retire either. And I know that a lot of people in the KOW locker room did not want you to retire either. And in a lot of ways, you were the moral compass of KOW. You were always justice, no pun intended. I mean, you always kept everybody in line in KOW, which is what made you very special to what KOW had to offer. I mean, you talk about the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus, and obviously you and him were always on different sides of the coin, or certainly a two-bit, or even to an extent the Lucas Neon or the unhinged Will Carter, where you, on the other hand, could help out, could even the odds. I mean, talk about the match when it's 1, 2, 3, because your partner, your old partner, King Ryan Grayson, interferes. I think in a lot of ways, it might not have been the number one match for KOW in 2019, but it was definitely the biggest shock when it came to your tag team partner turning on you and King Ryan Grayson. Talk about what's going on through your mind when that happens, because the crowd, we talked about the different spots in the match where the crowd kind of goes ooh and ah, and they're going after Rick. I mean, the crowd there, I think it was times 10 on how they felt when King Ryan Grayson went after you instead of the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus, because we know that he and Rick Marcus had a little bit of a back and forth leading up to that. I mean, what's going on through your mind when this happens?
Well, the first thing going through my mind was that vicious steel chair shot that Ryan landed right under my temple. I genuinely did not see that coming, and I don't think anybody saw that one coming. I mean, obviously, world situations have meant that there haven't been any shows since then, so we haven't even had a chance to hear Ryan's side of the story. But I don't think not since Shawn Michaels put Marty Jannetty through the barbershop window has there been such a betrayal in wrestling.
I could have actually said maybe the way Triple H turned on Shawn Michaels in 2002, that actually would have been very similar to that. You could maybe even throw in the NWO formation, but it's definitely up there. I mean, I have to say, listen, what King Ryan Grayson did to Sheriff Steele, it was definitely right up there. We were all expecting King Ryan Grayson to help you out and even the odds and finally put an end to the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus with you. And obviously that didn't happen. But also talk about, though, we know that the 1, 2, 3 happens. And we know, unfortunately, the outcome is that you have to retire and you no longer are a part of KOW. But talk about the crowd in the locker room emptying out, come out and give you that one last applause, that one last moment. That's something you're not going to see. I mean, we talked with Lucas when he beat 2-Bit for the Showcase Championship and what that crowd was like. But with this is one of those moments where it was almost like Hogan in Toronto. It was almost when The Rock came back. This was the kind of crowd reaction that you got. What did that mean to you when the crowd gave you that response and the locker room emptied to come out to give you that one last moment?
Not that there was many positives you can take from the outcome of that match, but I mean, if there was going to be one positive I could take, it was the crowd reaction and the guys coming out from the back. I turned around after giving my little speech, and I didn't expect to see them there. It was such a nice moment, a tribute almost, because it drives home that KOW is a family. We all kind of grew up together, most of us, and it's the same with the crowd. Like I said earlier, they were with me for my entire journey. So to know that at the end I meant that much to them was probably the only positive I can take away from that night.
Definitely should take away that positive, because there's very few people that get that kind of response, that kind of ovation, that kind of cheer that you got. You meant a lot to KOW. You mean a lot to us. And you said something that I want to go back to also, because we've gotten the opportunity to talk with a number of wrestlers over the past few months, not just everybody in KOW, but even a few other wrestling companies and several other wrestlers who wrestled elsewhere. But I feel like in KOW, it's a little different. The people of Barrow are a little different than even here in the States or other places in the UK that may have professional wrestling. There's a different relationship that you guys have with the KOW fan base, with with the people of Barrow. And you said family-friendly wrestling. KOW obviously is the biggest example of that. I mean, did you feel that KOW meant more maybe to you and others because of that relationship, that very intimate relationship that you guys had with everybody that followed KOW over these past several years?
I think you hit the nail right on the head there when you said intimate. The relationship between everybody at KOW, from ALP down to the camera guys, to the security, to the people who do the sound, and that extends into the fans as well. Because Barrow's such a small town, it's so close knit, and it's, well, in geographical terms for Britain, it's miles away from anywhere. So in a sense, I feel like the fans from Barrow treated KOW as it's their wrestling company. They were the only wrestling company that really did anything of note in Barrow. It's the only wrestling company that matters in Barrow. And I think that all stems from the size of the town and the fact that KOW has been going for 7-8 years, putting on just amazing shows. Every time was a sellout. Every time the crowd was ridiculously loud. Just the whole thing was just, again, like a perfect storm. The fans understood what we were trying to do, and we understood what the fans wanted. So it was just a perfect match.
Did that give you an extra bounce in your step each time you entered through that curtain going into the ring? Because with KOW, you had that crowd, you had that feel. I mean, I gotta think that when you visualize stepping into the ring, every time you did on behalf of KOW, that crowd gave you a little bit of an extra bounce in your step.
Oh, absolutely. That crowd is one of the main reasons why I actually made it to the top, because, I was never the most athletic. I was never the most aggressive. What I was is the guy who wanted to give his all. So when you hear the crowd being so loud for you, you really want to step up your game. They're giving you their best, so you need to give them your best in return.
Originally, I was going to compare your character to the Big Boss Man in a sense. And obviously getting to watch some of your matches, you could see you do have a little bit of that brawling type of feel, a little bit of that old school 1980s WWF feel to it. But in speaking with you and hearing you on the Sports Report, here on Sportinarium for the first time, I think in a lot of ways, you remind me a little bit of Diamond Dallas Page. The reason I say that is because Diamond Dallas Page didn't become a professional wrestler until he was about 39 or 40. So at least you got that working for you, Sheriff. But in terms of how he worked his way to the top, where he beats Randy Savage, he's in a feud with Hollywood Hulk Hogan, and then eventually he wins the WCW world title. And he's one of the oldest first-time world champions. Here's a guy that becomes a world champion at 43. Here's a guy that goes on to have the success that he had. And I think in a lot of ways, your character and how the crowd related to you, very similar to Diamond Dallas Page's journey in WCW, how he started out as the booty daddy, and then again, all the way up into where he wins the world title. Talk to me about what your thoughts are on that comparison to yourself and Diamond Dallas Page.
It's obviously a great comparison. DDP was fantastic. He really was the epitome of getting the crowd behind him. So to even have that comparison is such an honor. But you are right. He started off quite late, and his character evolved. He worked his way up, not just into the main title scene, but also he had different stages of his character developing, and it's kind of what I had as well. When I started out, I didn't have the Sheriff moniker. That came later. Just like, he may have started off as the booty daddy, but then he got a little bit more serious as time went on, and he became world champion, the oldest first-time champion, just like I went on to become KOW's oldest champion ever. I think I was 39 when I won the heavyweight title, so I don't see many people beating that age, to be honest.
Well, you never know. Listen, Vince McMahon always says never say never, but I know one thing. We are definitely honored to have here on the Sports Report, the #1 global sports show to kick off tonight's show and also the weekend shows here on Sportinarium is the legendary Sheriff Steele, arguably the most important wrestler to the history of KOW. And if there was a Hall of Fame for KOW, Sheriff Steele would be the first person that we would induct in. Arguably, his feud with the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus is arguably the greatest feud in KOW history. He's also a former world champion in KOW. KOW. He's the first ever tag team champion in KOW history. He also was an AOW tag team champion there. So obviously, Sheriff Steele is as accomplished as anyone as we've ever had here on the Sports Report. I am America's greatest export, the host of the Sports Report, the Reverend Tom Bryce. We are here on Sportinarium, and everybody can follow Sportinarium on Twitter and Instagram at Sportinarium. You can like Sportinarium on Facebook at Sportinarium Media. You can subscribe to the Sportinarium YouTube page at Sportinarium TV, and you can listen to Sportinarium 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year on Sportinarium.com, including the Sports Report from Friday to Sunday, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. UK time. That's from Friday to Sunday, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. UK time. And also, you can follow Knockout Wrestling on Twitter at KO_wrestling. That's KO_wrestling. You can also follow KOW on Instagram at K_O_wrestling. And you can also follow KOW on Facebook. So make sure that you keep updated with all the great things that KOW is a part of. Even though Sheriff Steele may not be a part of KOW, you can find a long list of accomplishments that Mr. Sheriff Steele has been a part of in KOW history. So I would make the argument that the future of KOW is very good because of the legendary Sheriff Steele. And we are definitely honored to have him here on the Sports Report. And Sheriff Steele, I know we're going to talk a lot more about KOW, but I got to also ask you, for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, what got you into wrestling?
Like I said earlier, I'm a little bit older than most of the guys you probably had on. So I'm a child of the 80s. So, that mid to late 80s WWF wrestling where everyone was a giant and everyone was a character. There was bright colors, there was loud music, there was larger than life characters doing larger than life things. Which 4, 5, 6-year-old isn't going to be enthralled by that? The first time I saw it, I think, was the first Royal Rumble where Hacksaw Jim Duggan won it. And I just think from then, I was just hooked.
I could definitely see that. I could definitely see why you were definitely hooked. And I know you get this question quite a bit, but did that in a lot of ways maybe inspire some of your attire and sort of how you came across in the ring?
Yeah, it's certainly how I wanted to style myself. Like I said, back then, everyone was a character. Everybody was larger than life. Funny, you mentioned the Big Boss Man earlier on. It's kind of a little bit of the genuine inspiration behind the Sheriff Steele character. Again, he was just, he was one of those deceptively agile men, even though he was a huge guy. And so whereas I wasn't maybe not as agile as these guys, making everything in the ring big and making everything in the ring matter, from the character to the moves to the things I used to wear, to everything, that was definitely all stems from a love of late 80s, early 90s WWF.
Yeah, I could definitely see it a lot of ways where you're coming from, because when you think about the 80s, everything in the 80s was done big. Everything in the 80s was done almost right in front of you. It was bold. It was aggressive. In a lot of ways, I think the Big Boss Man, the first run he had in the WWF, I think was an example of that. Obviously, he did remake himself, and I'm sure we'll actually get into that in a little while. So maybe in a way, you do have a lot more similarities to the Big Boss Man than we realize. But I got to bring up your entrance because I'm actually a huge heavy metal fan, and I'm a huge Anthrax fan. And when you came out to I Am the Law each and every time, I don't know if it was because you were an Anthrax fan, or it was because you really were the law. You were the law and order, no pun intended, to KOW. But for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, because we do play a lot of music here on the show, we actually play a lot of music here on Sportinarium, you got to talk to us about what was the inspiration to the Anthrax I Am the Law entrance.
Well, who doesn't like a bit of heavy metal? I think it lends itself absolutely perfectly. It lends itself perfectly to any wrestling theme. And so while I was looking for an entrance theme, once I had transitioned over into the Sheriff character, again, going back to the 80s, and, even, again, the Big Boss Man, his theme tune, it spelled out exactly what he was, and I think that's, a lot of people choose music just because it sounds good. Now, don't get me wrong, I Am the Law by Anthrax does sound amazing, but it was chosen particularly because of the actual words, I am the law. And obviously Sheriff Steele in KOW was there to be the upholder of the law. So it just seemed the perfect match.
Actually, it's a funny story. I should probably not mention this on the air, but I'll mention it on the air since we do have a worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium. But I actually first got into Anthrax because I was actually in the dean's office in high school. I had a friend who I became friends with, and he was actually somebody that used to burn CDs And one of the CDs I bought off him was Anthrax Among the Living. And obviously Among the Living had I Am the Law on there. And that's kind of how my story was. Actually, I don't even remember, Sheriff, I don't even remember what I was in Dean's office for. I don't remember what I did to be exact, but I always round up in the Dean's office for 3 out of 4 years in high school. I have no idea why, but I did. So obviously that's kind of my Anthrax I Am the Law tie into your I Am the Law tie into when you used it each and every time here in KOW. And I also want to talk about this for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, because we covered this with ALP. We talked about it with Will Carter, and I know that we talked about it with Lucas. And Cloud9 in the Lounge, I felt in a lot of ways that Cloud9 in the Lounge added something to KOW. And I know that you guys always wrestled in the academy, and I got to watch you a little bit, obviously, in some of your earlier matches and some of your work with Rick earlier on. But I felt in a lot of ways, especially even for the match against Rick, that Cloud9 in the Lounge really added something to KOW. It almost gave you guys a little bit more of a modern feel, and I think it added something to the promotion. I mean, talk about for you, for your vantage point, what did Cloud9 in the Lounge mean to you?
I mean, you're definitely right. It definitely gave us a more modern, fresher feel. I mean, when we found out that the original venue we were using, which is where I began training, it's where I had my first matches, it's where all of my firsts happened, was at the old venue. When we found out that we were going to have to find a new venue, I was a little bit sad about it, because that's where my wrestling career was born. But once I saw the new venue, Cloud9, it was streets ahead in terms of its feel and of its almost production value. It kind of propelled KOW up a level, because we went from that, which is quite common in Britain, is like the working men's club kind of scene where they have wrestling, and then to move to that newer venue with all the fancy lights and things, it almost legitimized KOW a bit more. And to be wrestling in such a, once you're inside and in the ring, it is a lovely venue to wrestle in. And so that, along with everything else, just lifted the whole company, and it lifted everybody who was performing in the ring. So whereas it's sad to leave the original venue, I think moving to the Cloud9 was ultimately a great step for the company.
Absolutely. And I felt a lot of ways it modernized the company, because Cloud9 the Lounge, from obviously watching the top 10 matches for KOW in 2019, really felt like you were watching a modern place. It was a nice little venue. I mean, you could really do a lot in that venue. You had the upstairs, you had the things to the side that you could use, you had the crowd you could really pack in a little bit more. So I kind of feel like in a lot of ways it added to a little bit more of an up-close, intimate feeling. No disrespect to where you guys trained out of, but I just think that Cloud9 in the Lounge really fitted you guys to a T. In a lot of ways, what we used to see to what Madison Square Garden used to mean to the WWE. And I think in a lot of ways, Cloud9 in the Lounge meant that much to you guys. And somebody that has meant a lot to us, we've had him on the show a couple of times. We're going to bring him back on, as we alluded to here at the top, and that's ALP. And we've called ALP the heart and soul of KOW. And I know that you've talked about ALP on social media, what he meant to you, and his relationship with KOWs is as good as anybody's. It is the best, to be honest. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that knows more about KOW than ALP, although we might have one person that might have a shot at competing against him for that. We'll bring up that person who I know is a little bit more special to you. But I know ALP meant a lot to your career. So for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, and we know that ALP is definitely listening to this, what did ALP mean to you?
Well, when you say LP is the heart and soul of KOW, you couldn't describe him any better. He is absolutely the reason that KOW is where it is. The time and effort and the love pours into KOW is astounding. And from a personal point of view, he's the guy who gave me my opportunity. He's the one who allowed me to get in the ring, and he's the one that also allowed me to expand the character. He was never one to step in your way. If you wanted something badly enough and he saw that you wanted it and it was for the best, he would almost give you free rein. And yeah, heart and soul just sums him up perfectly. Without him, there's no KOW. Without him, there's no Sheriff Steele. So, like you say, he is the most important person to KOW.
Absolutely. And as always, a huge shout out to the former general manager of KOW, also ring announcer and also promoter and booker. I mean, he pretty much wore every hat in KOW. So I want to make sure we give him a huge shout out. And I want to ask you, who had the better ring introduction, myself or ALP? Because I don't know if you know Sheriff. AOP actually introduced me the last time he came on the show. He actually brought out the chops and he actually introduced me. So I have to say that I will not ask you who had the better ring introduction. But speaking of somebody else who introduced you to the ring quite a bit throughout your time in KOW, that was also general manager to KOW. Now he's also moved on to Odyssey Pro Wrestling, and that's our very good friend Ethan Edwards, who's been on here a couple of times. And Ethan's another guy that has meant a lot to KOW. And talk about Ethan Edwards and what he meant to you and also to KOW.
Well, Ethan's another one who just has nothing but a love for wrestling, and that really comes across in everything that he does. The way he announces everyone in the ring, the way he announces anything, matches, upcoming matches, you can tell he loves wrestling. And anybody who loves wrestling is okay by me, So I've backstage, I've spoken to Ethan quite a lot. He's had his issues with authority regarding 2-Bit and Decker and the underclass. He came to me for some advice. And yeah, he's just another guy who just fit the KOW mold so perfectly. His love for wrestling, his understanding of giving the crowd what they want when it comes to his ring announcing. He's the first person that they were hearing in the last shows. He comes out, he gets them riled up. They give him the energy back. He gives them more energy back. And that sets everything in motion for us guys coming through the curtain because everybody's riled up, and it all comes from people like Ethan and their love for wrestling.
Absolutely. And as always, a huge shout out to the current Odyssey Pro Wrestling general manager, Ethan Edwards, because he has a lot of work cut out for him. He has a lot he is dealing with right now. So we will definitely make sure to give him a huge shout out as always. And I'm very sure we'll be talking with him again in the near and distant future as Odyssey Pro Wrestling is getting ready to set sail on August 7th. And there's already been a few matches announced, including one we talked about in last week's show. That's the Natural Born Fighter, RP Davis and Scotty Rock. So we're extremely excited about the future of Odyssey Pro Wrestling. But Sheriff, I got to bring it up because you alluded to it. And that was the underclass. And that was Andre Decker and 2-Bit, two of those three parts of the underclass. And we've had them on here recently. And I want to talk about Mr. Andre Decker first, because Andre Decker had some things to say about you. He talked about he wants the match between you and Sheriff Steele. And Sheriff, I know that you're retired. And I actually went out on a limb here for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium and on the Sports Report. I actually said WrestleMania 38 main event, you versus Andre Decker. And I know that you and Mr. Decker have mixed it up quite a bit here in the past. I mean, what do you have to say to that? I mean, would you come out of retirement for WrestleMania 38 main event, you versus Andre Decker? I mean, you got to talk to us here about your thoughts on Andre Decker.
Well, Andre Decker, obviously he is part of the trio that took mine and Ryan Grayson's tag team titles away. So I owe Decker something at least. So anytime Decker wants to step back in the ring, I will come out of retirement because I owe him for taking away my tag team titles. So I know he hasn't got them anymore, so I can't have them back. But a little bit of retribution would definitely make me sleep better at night.
And ladies and gentlemen, we do know that Andre Decker right now is a free agent, and technically Sheriff Steele is a free agent. So Vince McMahon, Triple H, Bruce Pritchard, if you're listening, WrestleMania 38 main event. I mean, we can book, instead of WrestleMania 38 in Dallas, why don't we have WrestleMania 38 in Barrow? You think about the attention you guys could have. You think about the fans that will be wanting to see this match between Andre Decker and Sheriff Steele. I mean, listen, the Mega Force is times 10. So I think that, Mr. Decker, you might have a match on your hands one of these days because Sheriff Steele has responded to what you had to say about him. So stay tuned for that one, ladies and gentlemen. We have a little feeling that we haven't heard the last of Andre Decker and Sheriff Steele by a long shot. But speaking of somebody else that we spoke with last week, Sheriff Steele, and somebody that had a lot of success in KOW, you got to see him from the very beginning rise up here to where he is today. And that's the Rat King 2-Bit. And you actually had a very, very interesting reaction, or I would say lack of respect that he had for you in his very first match with KOW, with him, the unhinged Will Carter, and Lucas Neon, who is currently the KOW Showcase champion. But you got to talk about that, where 2-Bit refused to shake your hand, and where we see 2-Bit today, the Rat King, the former leader of the underclass, the King of Chaps, the main event, the Gangster Lord. I mean, he's got so many names that Madonna probably would rival him when it comes to different names or different other gimmicks or characters or personas he may have. But for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, you got to talk to us about the Rat King 2-Bit and how you've seen him evolve throughout the ring here.
It's interesting with 2-Bit. I'm really torn because obviously I've seen him develop from a young age to where he is now, and where he is now is essentially just the beginning. You have to respect his dedication, his skill level, his willingness to improve his craft. So on that part, I really respect him. But then it's the way he goes about things. It doesn't really sit well with the whole Sheriff Steele ethos of doing things. So you're right. From that very first match between Will, Lucas, and 2-Bit when they made their debut at KOW, such a proud moment for especially someone like me who also came through the academy, slightly different path from being a bit older, but from seeing these guys come from being so young, finally making their debut. That's why I felt compelled to go out after the match and just let them know that not just me, but everybody involved with KW was very proud of them. And we expected big things and we're getting big things from them. Obviously, Lucas and Will, very respectful to their elders, shook my hand as they should. And then obviously we all saw what happened when 2-Bit refused. I think that was kind of obvious from day one, which path 2-Bit was going to choose to his way up to success.
Well, he definitely chose a path, to say the least. But in all seriousness, we have a very good feeling that 2-Bit is on his way to bigger and better things, because in addition to winning the Showcase title in his own right, he was also BWR Cruiserweight Champion. So we have a very good feeling that 2-Bit is on his way to bigger and better things. And I want to ask you this question, Sheriff, and talk to me about your thoughts on it, because I wasn't going to ask you this question, but now I'm going to ask it to you, because we talked about, obviously, 2-Bit, we talked about Lucas, and we talked about Will Carter. They even worked their way into a main event a few times, and especially 2-Bit. And 2-Bit literally was probably the MVP of KOW in 2019, because 6 of his matches were in the top 10. And he might be the world champion. He did make a fair point. He might be the KOW world champion if it wasn't for COVID, because he was scheduled to fight for the KOW world title. Did you feel in a lot of ways maybe a little bit more pressure because you saw that the crowd was starting to take a curiosity or a liking to some of the things that Lucas, 2-Bit, or even what Will Carter was introducing? Because in a lot of ways, they were introducing a style of wrestling, maybe with the exception of Chris Ridgway, that we really didn't get to see much in KOW. You were pretty much the big man on campus. You were pretty much the guy in KOW throughout your career. Did you feel in some ways that maybe you felt more pressure, more or less, keep up with the crowd or keep the crowd enthralled because of what 2-Bit, what Will Carter, and what Lucas were introducing to the KOW audience?
If there's one thing I could not do with those 3 guys is keep up. So it wouldn't even be something I could possibly attempt to do. But you're right, they were bringing in a whole new kind of generation and style of wrestling that was slightly different to what I was offering. It was different to what Craig Collins was offering. It was different to what Rick Marcus was offering, Ryan Grayson. We were all almost a little bit old school in our kind of approach. We were big, burly guys. Our focus was on power and almost a bit of brawling. And then you get these 3 young, hungry kids coming through, and just some of the things that you see them do was just ridiculous. Like I said earlier, I was in the ring with some of them, and I'm 20 years older than these guys. To see them in the ring and up close and have matches with them, you really could see how they were bringing a completely different style of wrestling to KLW. And it's one that the crowd loved and they ate it up. And you can just tell by the reactions that all 3 of them get. Okay, 2-Bit's reactions are slightly different to the other 2 guys, but you'll be still getting a reaction.
Well, 2-Bit's reactions are a lot different. I mean, he's pretty much the 360 reverse of you, or certainly a Lucas Neon. I don't even think the Cumbrian Outlaw Rick Marcus gets the reaction that 2-Bit gets. I mean, the Cumbrian Outlaw was definitely despised by the KOW fan base, but 2-Bit, I think it's times 10. I think it's 2-Bit dialed by 11, I think, in terms of what the crowd felt when it came to him. But I want to ask you about Lucas Neon, because Lucas Neon had a moment that pretty much rivals what you had in terms of that relationship in the crowd. And he's the current Showcase champion, and he had a lot to say about you, and you meant a lot to him because you've known him. I think your relationship with Lucas is probably a little different than anybody else in KOW, because he clearly looked up to you. He's clearly known you pretty much for most of his life. So it's a little different than the way 2-Bit looks at you. It's a little different than your peer Rick Marcus would, or Taylor West, or Craig Greg Collins or certainly King Ryan Grayson. But talk to me about Lucas Neon and how do you feel you've seen Lucas Neon evolve and what those comments he had to say about you, what did that mean to you?
Well, like you say, I've known Lucas, I mean, even outside of wrestling, I've known Lucas since he was 5 or 6 years old. Again, that just shows you how old I actually am. But, he was there at my very first training session with KOW because he came along with his dad, who is KOW wrestler Hudson Payne. So he was there from the beginning for me. And then obviously I was there for the beginning of his wrestling career and his training sessions, and see where he came from and the steps he's made, not just technically with his wrestling ability, but with his confidence and the way he can hold a crowd. It makes me immensely proud. I would almost think that I maybe had a little hand in it just because he's always come to me for advice. But I mean, some of the loudest reactions I've ever heard in the KOW arena have been for Lucas Neon. I mean, when he won the Showcase title, the noise was just phenomenal. And that just goes to show the crowd love Lucas Neon. There's a big hole in KOW now, fan favorite. And I really think that Lucas could really step in and become the crowd's number one beloved wrestler.
Absolutely. The future is definitely Neon when it comes to Lucas Neon and KOW. We're definitely going to miss you, Sheriff, when it comes to KOW in terms of that relationship with the fans. But before I ask you about Will Carter, and I will definitely ask you about Will because he's somebody also who's meant a lot to us here over the past few months, and he's been a part of some really important matches. It was somebody else actually who, for one night, Sheriff, actually united you and the Cumbrian outlaw, Rick Marcus. And that was somebody named Louis, who we've talked about here on a few different shows. We talked about him with ALP. We talked about him with Lucas Neon. We talked about him with, obviously, the Cumbrian outlaw, Rick Marcus, and also the unhinged Will Carter. But your relationship, again, and this is a theme, your relationship with KOW as a whole was a lot different than anybody else. But Louis meant a lot to everybody at KOW, but to you especially, I know he meant a lot. And talk about Louis and what he meant to you for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, and especially for the many KOW fans who are listening to this.
I mean, Louis is just he's just a personification of a superstar. He is such a fan of KOW. I mean, not just me, but he's a fan of the whole company. He's at every show. He's right there at the front. And when I say he knows more about KOW than anyone, I'm not kidding. Me and ALP visited him once at his house, and we had a little quiz about KOW. And without me allowing him to win, he wiped the floor with me on a quiz about KOW. A lot of the questions were actually about my career and my matches, and he knew more, or he remembered more than I could remember. He is just the greatest kid. And he is really the reason, if you could bundle up the reason that most of us get into wrestling, it's for people like Louis. You can see it on his face when his favorites win. You see it on his face when his favorites lose. The reactions are just the reason that we do it. And he's my number one fan. I'm his number one fan. And KOW just wouldn't be the same without him.
Absolutely. And listen, I think Louis could do these interviews instead of me. And I think there'd be a lot more people listening to these on Sportinarium. So we definitely want to acknowledge Louis, and we definitely want to make sure that we recognize him because he's somebody that has meant a lot to so many people in KOW. And I think, again, ladies and gentlemen, that's what makes KOW so special, because the wrestlers and the fans have a different relationship. Listen, we just talked with a company that was on Fight TV here in the States, and you look at them and it was like just very goofy. It didn't, to me, like I didn't get it. But with you guys, like, I'm all in. I mean, I tell you the truth. I mean, I get fired up every time I get the opportunity to talk with KOW because all of you just bring so much, and there's just so much organic energy. And I think that that's what makes KOW so special. And that's why we are very proud to be continuing to talk KOW with the legendary Sheriff Steele, former KOW world champion, the first ever tag team champion in KOW history, and arguably the most important wrestler in KOW history. And I am the host of the Sports Report, the Reverend Tom Bryce. We're here talking with Sheriff Steele about all things related to his career in KOW. And Sheriff, I got to bring this up because it was sort of your creations, you and King Ryan Grayson, when the World Justice was on the good side of things, and you and him were doing good for us here in KOW. But what led you to being the first ever tag team champion in KOW? Because we know that ALP did not want to have a tag team title in KOW. We heard his side of the story, but we got to hear your your side of the story on what led you to deciding to have a tag team championship and eventually to the creation of the tag belts in KOW.
The real story behind it is actually, I find it hilarious. You see, it actually all stems from my daughter, who I think at the time when this came about could only have been 8 or 9. Now, much to my chagrin, my daughter's favorite wrestler has always been King Ryan Grayson, even when he was on the wrong side of justice. And I found a picture in the bedroom that she had drawn. Again, she's 8 or 9, possibly even younger. And the picture was my 2 favorite wrestlers. One was me, you would hope, being her dad, and the other was King Ryan Grayson. So I took a screenshot of this picture and I sent it to ALP and I said, there you go, there's your next tag team. And I was obviously just joking because King Ryan Grayson and Sheriff Steele were nowhere near being on the same page. But one thing led to another. Even though Ryan Grayson at the time may have been unjust, Sheriff Steele still believed in justice for the unjust. And while he was getting beaten down one match, Sheriff Steele stepped in to save Ryan Grayson because, justice knows no bounds. So, and from that, the relationship between myself and Ryan Grayson it grew, and slowly but surely he began to see the good side and how much it can make him feel better to win without cheating. And I felt it was needed. You needed something to keep him on the side of good. So that's when I decided to introduce the very real, very legitimate tag team titles. Were actually some replica WWF tag titles that I found on eBay.
It's funny you said that because I always wanted a title. I always wanted to buy one of those.
Well, I pitched it. I pitched it to ALP, and he was like, "No, we don't have a tag division." And I thought, well, I'm going to make a tag division. We kind of toyed with the idea of me having these titles. I showed them to Ryan Grayson. I publicly showed them to King, and he was on board. And all of a sudden, we were defending these titles. Of course, ALP said that they weren't legitimate, but we were allowed to defend our own property. But from there, before they became, really legitimate, I feel that we legitimized the tag division, myself and King Ryan Grayson. We were having teams from outside of KOW who wanted to challenge us for them. That's the gravitas these wonderful titles had. And I'll be honest, up until the breakup of Royal Justice, the time I had with Grayson was just some of the most fun I've ever had in wrestling.
We even heard, ladies and gentlemen, that at one time the New Day wanted a shot at these titles. We even heard that the Bullet Club wanted a shot at these titles. We even heard that the Young Bucks wanted a shot at these titles. We even heard that the Hardys, the Dudleys were going to get back together and get a shot at these titles. So these titles were very popular. And speaking of one half of the current tag team champions, and we've alluded to him, we've talked about him quite a bit. He sort of makes up this trio here when it comes to kind of the young guns of KOW. And that's the unhinged Will Carter, who was a part of the Freak Show, which is the tag team champions alongside Nightmare, who's also had a long history, a long career in KOW. But I wanted to ask you then, for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinaria, but what's your thoughts on one half of the current KOW tag team champions and the unhinged Will Carter?
I think out of the trio that we've spoken about, Lucas and Two-Bit and Will Carter is the most unpredictable. You just don't know what he's going to do next. Again, seeing him come through from such a young age and watching him develop that style, it was obvious from the beginning he was going to do things a little bit differently than the other two, a little bit less conventional. Kyle is certainly less conventional than the other two. I love watching Will Carter wrestle. It amazes me the speed at which he can move around the ring, and said that unpredictability that brought a whole new level of wrestling, a whole new style of wrestling into KOW. And I think his pairing with Nightmare at the moment, as with a lot of the things in KOW, is just absolutely perfect. I mean, they are made for each other, and I'm very pleased that they now have the tag team titles, and they're not in the hands of Decker and the underclass anymore.
Well, we know that you have had quite a lot to say about Mr. Decker, and obviously he was part of the underclass that were the tag team champions in KOW. And thankfully, a little bit of justice was restored, knowing that the Freak Show have the tag team titles. And the unhinged Will Carter, in a lot of ways, reminds me of a little bit of a shorter version of Marilyn Manson in his look. I mean this is a compliment, because obviously Marilyn Manson is such an iconic figure, especially as such an iconic figure in music, especially in the 1990s. So I mean that obviously in a tremendous compliment to him. And I got to ask you then, for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, because we alluded to it in the fact that you were a world champion in KOW. And it was really one of the biggest underdog stories. It was really one of the biggest things, I think, to ever happen in KOW, and how you rose and worked your way up to win that title. And what did it mean to you to be the KOW world champion?
I mean, obviously, to win any title in anything that you do is a wonderful honor. But the fact that it was KOW, it was in front of the KOW fans, and the fact that it was 7 years of me working from the very bottom to the very top. You know, I look back now and I still can't believe that it happened. When I first started, I'm sure nobody thought that this older guy was never going to make it to the top. But, you know, I didn't really believe it. But as time went on, I started to believe it. And I think that the fans started to believe it as well. So when I went into that match at the 6th anniversary show, I went in with a belief that it was very possible that I could win it. But now when I sit here looking back, having obviously retired and not wrestling anymore, it's still one of those moments that it's just hard to sink in. The crowd were loud. There was confetti everywhere. It was definitely the ultimate underdog story. And it just means the world to me that I was able to make it to the very top of KLW.
Anything can happen. You never know what can happen. Life is a box that's full of chocolates. And clearly, Sheriff Steele rose up and he did it. He defied the odds. And he did something that very few people will ever do. And that's hold a world title. And he definitely did hold that world title. And he made KOW very proud, especially for all the fans here. But you said something interesting there, Sheriff. And I got to go back to it, because you did talk about retirement. And I know that the KOW fan base may remember you with a certain look and a certain image, but very similar to some of the other wrestlers that we've had on the show, like the Cumbrian Outlaw Rick Marcus, or a 2-Bit, for example, or the Natural Born Fighter RP Davis. I mean, Sheriff Steele, you look like a completely different person, a completely different character these days. I mean, at this point, you look like you might be somebody that could actually go in the ring with a 2-Bit, with a Lucas Neon, with the unhinged Will Carter, because you were down apparently nearly 100 pounds. I mean, you even said something on social media that just maybe you have to revisit your retirement plans. I mean, we know that can't be in KOW, and you did kind of allude to that when it came to Mr. Decker, but you are a changed man, a new man. Listen, 2021, you are a new and improved Sheriff Steele, to say the least. I mean, I think you probably could go at this point with the likes of a 2-Bit, with the likes of a Lucas Neon, or with the likes of the unhinged Will Carter. So I got to ask you then, never say never?
You would be absolutely right. Never say never. I mean, the reason for the weight loss and the change had nothing to do with wrestling. But, you know, now that I have lost all the weight, I am kind of thinking to myself, and I'm just wondering, I wonder if I could go again. So you are 100% right. Never say never. I've got my eyes on a few companies over here in Britain that might be looking for challengers. And yeah, you just never know. So maybe not 2021, but I'd look out in 2022, because I think Sheriff Steele possibly might be coming back.
Ladies and gentlemen, you very well may have heard it first here on the Sports Report, the #1 global sports show, and that we just maybe may not have heard the last from Sheriff Steele. And listen, ladies and gentlemen, I would remind everybody that the new and improved Sheriff Steele look is very similar to the Big Boss Man improvement. If you remember, in 1998, we saw him as this really big guy in WCW. He ballooned, and all of a sudden he came back in the 1998, right before Survivor Series, and he was sort of the enforcer for Mr. McMahon, and he looked like a completely different person. And we saw all the success that the Big Boss Man had right after that. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, you just never know. I mean, for all we know, we might even see new attire for Sheriff Steele, maybe similar to the Big Boss Man. Maybe we'll see that all black garb and those black looking sunglasses, and maybe the arms out now, because he's jacked now, Sheriff Steele. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned as we have a few more minutes with the legendary Sheriff Steele here on the Sports Report. And Sheriff, I got to ask you this question, because actually you were also a tag team champion in Alpha Omega Wrestling. You were also the last tag team champion there with Captain Wristlock Matt Fox, and we haven't got a chance to talk about that. So then, for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium, what did it mean to you to be the last ever?
Well, Alpha Omega Wrestling is very similar to KOW KOW in terms of the fan base. There's a saying in Britain, it's still real in Morecambe, which is where Alpha Omega was based. And Matt was another guy that I had great fun with. So to actually be champion with Matt and to be the last champion of Morecambe as a tag team means a great deal to me.
If I said to you that you were the most important wrestler to KOW's history, what would that mean to you?
It'd be an absolute honor to even have that mentioned to me. But I mean, I would have to then say that everybody who steps through the doors at KOW plays an equally important part with what's going on at KOW. But I will certainly take the compliment, and it certainly means a lot to me because the whole company, the fans, everybody means a lot to me. So to know that I mean a lot to them is something great.
What's your thoughts on the current KOW world champion, the War Machine, Craig Collins?
It's in his name, Machine. The man is an absolute machine. I think it's a travesty that he doesn't wrestle in more places. It's a travesty he doesn't wrestle in bigger places because he is an absolute unit. I've been in the ring with him. I've been hit by him. I've been picked up by him. The guy is just pure brute strength, but also he has such an agility and such a wrestling ability. I don't think that there's many who can match his power and his speed. So, like I said, he's still quite young. I think he's another one who's destined for bigger and better things.
If there were a KOW Hall of Fame, and if I said to you that you would be one of the first people inducted into that, what would that mean to you?
It would be a huge honor because, again, there's recognition from your peers, recognition from the fans. Any kind of recognition is great. And to be thought of in a positive manner is all that we can ask for in anything, not just wrestling, but, in life. So if that's the impact I've had on the fans and on my fellow wrestlers and on the company as a whole, then I'll take it, and it would mean the world to me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we mentioned it at the very top. Sheriff Steele was history making, he was enthralling, and he was honorable. And there is no better person to induct, if there were a KOW Hall of Fame, than Sheriff Steele, because he did it all, and he did it his own way. But most importantly, he did it the right way. And they say that a rising tide lifts all boats. And Sheriff Steele always lifted the boats of KOW. And he most importantly always uplifted the KOW fans' boats. And I could not think of no better example, no greater person that should be inducted into the KOW Hall of Fame. So ALP, we know that you're listening to this. I am sure you will definitely have a comment or two on it when we speak with you soon. So we will definitely, I'm sure, have not heard the last of this. But Sheriff Steele, we know that you're a very busy man. We know that you're getting requests left and right. We know that you're getting ready maybe for a match with Andre Decker at WrestleMania 38. Who knows if Vince McMahon is calling you after this interview? Who knows if Tony Khan is calling you after this interview? Who knows if Court Bauer is calling you after this interview? Who knows even if the Cumbrian Outlaw Rick Marcus maybe wants to respond to some of the things you had to say about him when it came to your legendary feud with him, which we think is arguably the greatest feud in KOW history. It was a tremendous honor to be able to cover that with you. But we know that you've had a lot of important moments that stand out most in your career, especially in KOW. And we could probably list at least 10 or 11 of them, maybe even more. But for our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarian, and especially for the KOW fans that are going to be listening to this, is there one or two moments that stand out most in your career?
Well, I mean, obviously, a title win at the 6th anniversary show is the pinnacle of your career, or pinnacle of my career. Any title win should be the pinnacle of your career. So that would definitely be up there. But there's another moment. It might seem quite a small one to some people, but to me, and I think that ALP actually mentioned it, there was a moment, and I can't remember the show, but all I know is that Craig Collins on the receiving end of a beatdown, a rather unfair beatdown at the end of one of the shows, and it was the crowd actually started chanting for Sheriff Steele to come out and help Craig Collins. Now, at the time, the Sheriff Steele persona had only just started, so to know that the fans knew that when something like that was going down, the man that they could rely on was Sheriff Steele was one of the moments that made me realize that Sheriff Steele was doing something right. So again, that might not seem a big thing to other people, but to me, that's right up there for me as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that Sheriff Steele always makes sure that justice is served. I always hope that Sheriff Steele, no matter where he is, always does the right thing. And if you think about it, there was the bat signal, right? Well, maybe we got to have the sheriff signal. Maybe like the sirens or something has to come on. We have to think about something. Sheriff, we have to think about something. There has to be some type of way. Maybe some siren will come off or just something, because you always made sure that everybody had a fair advantage. You always made sure that you did the right thing. That's why we know that we haven't heard the last of you somewhere. I don't know if it's going to be in the WWE. I don't know if it's with Andre Decker. I don't know if it's whoever it may be. But I pray, Sheriff Steele, that we have not heard the last of you in the ring, because not only have you meant so much to us here on the Sports Report and on Sportinarium, but you've meant so much to so many people in the ring, whether it was your competitors, whether it was those who are colleagues of yours, whether it was an ALP or an Ethan or even a Louis. You just meant so much to so many people. That's why this was a special one for us. This was a real treat. This was a tremendous honor. I know that King Ryan Grayson, I'm sure that you're going to eventually one day, you got to try to get him back. It's been a long time now, Sheriff, since what happened to you in the Sheriff Rules retirement match against Rick Marcus, which was a tremendous honor to be able to cover with you. But for you, my friend, I want to give you the floor. I want to give you the closing thoughts. I also want you to plug all of your social media, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, or anything else that you might like to share, so our worldwide audience listening here on Sportinarium can keep up to date with all the great things that you're doing and all the great things that you're going to do on your journey for whatever it may lead you to be. And also anything that you might want to say to many of your fans in KOW, anything that you might want to say to them, and we know that they are listening. So I want to turn it over to you. I want to give you the floor. I can't thank you enough. So please plug all of your social media and anything you want to say to the KOW fans listening here on Sportinarium. Be my guest, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just start by saying that it was a real honor to be on. I've listened to all the interviews with all of my colleagues and things, and to finally be on speaking to you and all of your fans worldwide, it's such an honor. And thank you very much for all your very kind words. As for the fans of KOW, I know it's been a tough year. We haven't seen any wrestling for such a long time, but I know that KOW is going to come back. It's going to come back as strong as ever, as exciting as ever, as family friendly as ever. You know, ALP is still behind the scenes working tirelessly, making sure that when we do finally come back, you guys, the fans, are going to have exactly what you'd be missing from KLW. Okay, I might not be there to be a part of it, but I'll still be keeping an eye on things. And as you alluded to earlier, King Ryan Grayson, look over your shoulder, because I don't think we're through just yet. If you want to follow me on any social medias, I am on Twitter at Steele_Justice. Also the same on Instagram. You can follow me on those and check my progress, and maybe you'll see some announcements about where I may or may not be appearing in 2022.
Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you, Sheriff. Sheriff, I felt that you deserve that, because I know that a lot of people in KOW would still like to give you one more of those, because you deserve it. You've meant so much to KOW. You've meant so much to those people in Barrow. You've meant so much to a Louise. You've even meant so much to your colleagues. We've heard what Lucas Neon had to say about you. We know that your history with Rick Marcus is going to stand the test of time. We know that you've meant so much to countless people. And I wanted to say thank you on behalf of all of those people. So I can't thank you enough, most importantly, for all that you've done for the people of Barrow, for the people of KOW, making sure that justice was always served. And we know that justice will be served one way or another, and somebody will pick up that mantle, because your void is too great to leave unfilled. And anything we can ever do for you, you just let us know. You just give us the sheriff siren, whatever you want to call it. And we hope to hear that I Am the Law Anthrax music played again. And I can't thank you enough. I'm looking forward to the future. Congratulations on a great career in KOW, and we're looking forward to the future with you, and we will definitely speak with you soon, my friend.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
As we're here on the Sports Report, the #1 global sports show with the greatest wrestler in KOW history. That is Sheriff Steele. The former KOW World Champion and Tag Team Champion. He was also the last ever AOW Tag Team Champion, and I am America's greatest export, the host of the Sports Report, the Reverend Tom Bryce, and stay tuned for more talk on professional wrestling when it comes to the asset Stephen Cross as we continue to talk all the latest happenings in the world of professional wrestling as we get ready for AEW Double or Nothing and we recap Monday Night Raw as we were just with the legendary Sheriff Steele, the history-making, honorable, and enthralling great Sheriff Steele, who was also recently named part of the number 2 match of 2019 in KOW in his retirement match, loser leaves match, Sheriff rules against the Cumbrian outlaw Rick Marcus. So stay tuned for more hard-hitting analysis here on the Sports Report and on Sportinarium. With the asset Stephen Cross, I am the host of the Sports Report, the Reverend Tom Bryce. We were just with the legendary Sheriff Steele.